The courtroom was full and quiet in a hard way, the kind of quiet that presses on your chest. The judge's voice cut through it and said the words that broke 3 small hearts and 2 big ones. 2 children to the mother, 1 child to the father. Michael, the youngest, reached out both hands and cried, "Mummy." His little voice shook the room. Ruth stood up fast, then stopped because the bailiff moved. Daniel's hand was firm around Michael even though his eyes were not. The ceiling fan hummed, shoes scraped, nobody breathed. This was the moment that would change birthdays, school runs, bedtimes, and the sound inside 2 different houses. The court clerk wrote. The lawyers looked satisfied on the outside and tired on the inside. The law had spoken, but love had not finished speaking. The room smelled of old wood and paper and fear. Ruth's lips trembled. Daniel's jaw locked. Michael's tears fell straight down. In that moment, everyone understood that a home could break without any wall fall. Before this day, there were late nights and loud voices in a flat near GRA Port Harcourt. There were bills. There were long hours at Daniel's office by Transamati and long shifts for Ruth at a small pharmacy near Mile 1. At first, the marriage had laughter. They cooked jollof on Sundays. They prayed. They held newborn David and promised simple things like school, safety, and storybooks. But stress grew. Money entered the house and left fast. Pride entered slower and stayed longer. Ruth wanted presence. Daniel wanted progress. Words were like small nails at first. Later, they were like hammers. Family members took sides. Mama Agnes told Daniel, "A man provides. Don't let anyone shame you." Pastor John told them both, "Choose peace. Choose the children." They tried counseling. They tried quiet. Then they tried silence. The love did not die in one day. It faded like light during a power cut. One night, the argument was too sharp. The next morning, a suitcase was by the door. After that, lawyers came. On the first hearing, Barrister Esther spoke for Ruth with a calm tone that carried weight. "My lord, my client has been the steady hand in the lives of these children. She knows their hospital cards. She knows which one fears thunder. She knows which one will only take pap if you sing. She earns little, yes, but she gives much." Ruth stood straight. Her eyes were red from not sleeping, but her back did not bend. She held a folder with vaccination records and school notes. Maria, the social worker, looked at her and saw duty, not drama. Justice Alad watched everything. He watched the way Ruth turned when she heard Michael cough. He watched the way Joy held Ruth's skirt without thinking. He wrote small notes. He asked steady questions. He did not rush. The room felt old and careful. Outside, Port Harcourt moved fast with horns and heat. Inside, time slowed for 3 small lives. When Barrister Peters spoke for Daniel, his voice was smooth and clean. "My lord, my client can provide a stable home in a quiet estate. He can pay for the best schools. He can afford private clinics. He has a driver for school runs. He has a nanny. He is not a cruel man. He is a firm father. He wants these children to rise. Daniel's suit fit well." His watch flashed once and then stayed still. He did not look at Ruth often, and when he did, the look was heavy and guarded. He loved his children in a way he understood, through provision, planning, and protection. He feared poverty the way some people fear deep water, because he had seen it as a boy. He believed that houses and cars and gates could keep children safe. He did not know how to show softness without feeling weak. He thought about his father's voice. He thought about his own name in the community. He thought about winning. Witnesses came. Mr. Collins from the next flat told the truth in simple lines. "I saw her with the children most evenings. Homework on the table. Kerosene stove on. If there was shouting, it was both ways. If there was food, she shared first. A teacher said David was bright but tense lately. Joy had started biting her nails. Michael clung to the class aide at drop-off. Maria, the social worker, visited both homes. Daniel's place was neat, large, and quiet in a way that echoed. Ruth's place was small, warm, and busy with drawings stuck to the wall using tape. Maria wrote that both parents loved the children, but in different languages, one in structure, one in presence. Justice Alad read slowly. He asked for one more day. Everybody waited. Waiting stretched like a long, hot afternoon without power. The ruling came. It was careful. It was heavy. "In the best interest of the children," the judge said, "2 shall live with their mother. 1 shall live with their father. There shall be visitation on a set schedule. There shall be respect. There shall be no poison of mind." The words were law, but they did not feel like peace. Ruth reached for David and Joy, and they ran into her arms fast and hard. Michael's small hand stayed inside Daniel's larger one, and he tried to reach across with the other hand. It looked like a bridge that could not reach the other shore. Ruth cried without sound. Daniel stood very straight because if he bent, he feared he would break. The bailiff cleared a path. Papers were stamped. The decision lay on the table like a cold meal nobody wanted but had to eat. That night, in Ruth's flat, the power blinked out and candles came on. David asked if Michael was safe. Joy asked if they would see him on Saturday. Ruth cooked simple rice and let them talk without stopping them. She sang a small song during dishes because silence was too loud. Her phone buzzed with messages. Some people said, "God will fight for you." Others said, "Appeal." A few said nothing, which hurt more than words. Ruth sat by the window after the children slept. She looked at the empty chair. She remembered Michael's soft hair under her palm during fever nights. She pressed her hand to her chest and breathed slow. She made a small plan on paper. Morning routine, school drop, extra shift, visit schedule, save for a bigger room, do not cry in front of them, cry in the bathroom if needed. Pray. In Daniel's house, the AC hummed and everything worked. Michael had a new bed and a small toy car that lit up. He liked the light but looked at the door often. The nanny tried. She was kind and followed a schedule. Daniel watched from the hallway like a man guarding a gate. He read to Michael from a picture book. He did not do voices. He felt silly trying. Michael turned the pages back to the first page and said, again, but he did not settle. Dinner was good food with no crumbs on the floor. Michael ate little. Later, Daniel carried his son to bed. The boy put a hand on Daniel's cheek, then pulled it away like he was not sure. Daniel sat in the dark after that. The house felt big in a wrong way. He opened his phone and looked at photos of all three children on a beach day in Bonny Island. He closed his eyes. He put the phone face down. The visitations began. Saturdays were handovers in a church car park where there was shade and space. The first Saturday, Michael saw Ruth and ran so fast his shoe came off. Ruth knelt and held him for a long time. She checked his fingers. She kissed his forehead. Daniel stood a short distance away with David and Joy. Nobody spoke for a full minute. Then Joy started talking about a drawing she made. David asked about a science project. Daniel listened and nodded and tried to smile in a way that did not look forced. The clock moved too fast and too slow at the same time. When it was time to go back, Michael cried again. Daniel carried him gently to the car. Ruth stood still and kept her face composed until the car door closed. Then she pressed her palm to her mouth. Maria watched from her car and wrote notes that were not just about law, but about human hearts, trying to learn new steps. School picked its own side, which was routine. David focused on math. Joy found dance. Michael learned to sleep with a small shirt that smelled like his mother's soap. Daniel came for PTA with a careful face. Ruth came for clinic days with a careful voice. Rumors tried to grow in the compound, as they always do. Mr. Collins shut them down with a wave of his hand. Focus on your own meter reading, he told people. Pastor John called both parents to a quiet meeting. He spoke about the children's minds, not about blame. He gave them a shared notebook to pass between houses for health notes, school notes, and any fear a child mentioned at night. It was a simple tool. It worked better than long speeches. On some pages, Daniel's handwriting leaned strong and straight. On others, Ruth's notes were round and steady. The book became a bridge when words failed. Then came the scare. Michael had a cough that did not stop. One night, it turned hard with heat and fast breathing. The nanny called Daniel. Daniel drove fast to St. Martin's Clinic. He signed forms and paced. He called Ruth with a voice that had no pride in it. Please come. He is asking for you. Ruth arrived in slippers and a wrapper and did not care who looked. She stepped to the bed, put a cool cloth on Michael's head, and started that low hum he knew from baby days. Michael's shoulders dropped. The doctor checked. It was a chest infection. They caught it early. Antibiotics, nebulizer, steam, rest. The doctor asked who would stay. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it, then said, both of us. They stayed on 2 plastic chairs through the night. They did not talk about the past. They counted breaths. They took turns dozing. They were a father and a mother in a small room with a sick child and a beeping machine that did not care about court orders. In the morning, Michael was better. Not perfect. Better. The doctor smiled. "He needs both of you calm," he said. "Children hear stress like loud music." Daniel looked at Ruth then. Really looked. He saw the lines under her eyes that he had not caused alone, but had added to. He remembered a day long ago when she waited for him under rain near Rumokoro because his car broke down and she brought food in a nylon bag. Ruth looked at Daniel and saw the boy he had been, hard on himself, hungry to prove something to a shadow. They did not forgive everything in 1 second. They did agree on one thing in that second. They would not use the children as weapons. They would use the notebook, not their tempers. They would keep Saturday handovers simple. They would share photos without point scoring. They shook hands like people who had carried the same heavy load all night. Weeks turned into a new kind of rhythm. Ruth's flat stayed small, but felt safer. She got a second evening shift at the pharmacy and a neighbor watched the kids for 2 hours. Daniel started leaving the office at 6 on Michael days. He learned the bedtime story, voices, badly at first, then better. He attended Joy's school dance and cheered soft but steady. David asked Daniel for help with a solar project. They built a small panel together on a Saturday morning and did not talk about the court. Maria, the social worker, did a follow-up and noted less fear in Joy's hands, more focus in David's eyes, and fewer night coughs for Michael. The shared notebook grew thicker with small facts that made big peace. Nightmares dropped. Smiles returned, not always, but more often, like power coming back earlier than expected. Trouble came again, but in a different shape. Daniel's mother, Mama Agnes, visited and spoke with the weight of an older world. "You are the man. Bring your children under one roof. This sharing is shame." Her words carried love and pride and pressure. Daniel listened and felt old training wake up. He wanted to please his mother. He wanted to protect his son. He also wanted to keep the new quiet he had worked for. He told her the truth. "Mummy, this roof is strong, but it is not the only roof that loves them." She frowned. She said prayers loud. Ruth heard about it 2 days later and waited for a fight that did not come. Instead, Daniel called and said, "Please let us keep doing what works for them." Ruth said, "Yes." It was a small win with a big echo. Not every battle is in court. Some are in living rooms with tea and old rules. Then a bigger test arrived. Daniel got a tempting offer to relocate to Lagos for a new role with more pay, more status, and more distance. HR wanted an answer fast. He stared at the offer letter. He imagined Banana Island views, a driver waiting downstairs, and a title that would silence certain whispers. He also imagined how with Saturday handovers breaking, Michael's cough returning, David's project losing its partner, Joy dancing and looking for a familiar face in the crowd and not seeing it. He drove to the waterfront late and watched the dark water. He called Pastor John. He did not ask for a Bible verse. He asked a simple question. If I win this job and lose their peace, what have I won? The line stayed quiet. Then Pastor said, "You already know." Daniel said he would stay. He surprised himself. He surprised HR. He did not surprise Ruth. She had started to see that his love, though different from hers, was real and learning. The weeks passed, and while things were settling into a routine, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that they were still living in a fragile balance. Michael had grown used to the alternating weekends, but there was something in his eyes that still longed for the simplicity of being together all the time. Ruth noticed it, especially when he asked why he couldn't have both parents at the same time, like his friends did. She would answer with the same gentle smile, but inside, it hurt. She had never imagined her children would have to adjust to living between two homes. Yet, she could see it in their faces. The way they adapted, not out of choice, but out of necessity. In that moment, Ruth realized that while they were managing, their hearts were still divided. She wished they could give the children more, but the space between them was real, and the court's decision had sealed their fate. Daniel, too, felt the weight of it. His offer to give the children a stable home in Lagos still lingered in his mind, though he had never spoken about it directly to Ruth. He wasn't sure if moving the family was the right choice, but he could see how the children were caught between two worlds. Ruth sat alone on a Saturday evening, watching Michael as he played with his toy cars. It was a quiet evening, one that stretched on forever. The sound of the cars rolling on the floor was the only thing filling the space. Her mind wandered back to the first years of their marriage when every evening had been full of promise and laughter. She had worked hard to create that image of a perfect family, but the cracks had appeared slowly, small at first, then large enough that they could no longer ignore them. The truth was, she had poured everything into her children. They were her lifeline, her reason for everything. But what would it mean for them to continue living this way? Would they ever be whole again? Ruth wasn't sure. But the future felt uncertain. Michael had adapted, yes, but his words haunted her. "Why can't we all live together, Mummy?" The simplicity of his question was the very thing Ruth had been avoiding. The truth of the matter. She hadn't answered him that day, and the silence she left in response had been louder than words. She wanted to protect them, to shield them from the hurt, but was it possible to protect them from themselves? The day that Barrister Esther called Ruth with the news about Daniel's reconsideration of custody hit like a storm. She stood in the kitchen, holding the phone, her heart racing. "What do you mean he wants full custody?" Ruth had asked, barely able to breathe. Esther had explained calmly. "He wants a chance to bring the children together in one home. He's willing to meet you halfway, Ruth. He understands that this split is difficult for all of you. He just wants a fair chance to be there for them." Ruth had thought about the moment in court when the judge had spoken those fateful words when the family was divided. It had been necessary then, but now, as she stood in her small kitchen, the news hit her with a weight she wasn't prepared for. Would Michael be okay if they lived in Daniel's home full time? Would it feel like abandoning him to let go of that last piece of her? And yet, in the back of her mind, Ruth knew that Daniel wasn't trying to take her children away. He was trying to offer them something she couldn't, the stability that he believed they needed. But at what cost? The meeting with Daniel was scheduled for the following week. Ruth's hands trembled as she prepared for it. It had been so long since they had sat together in the same room, not fighting but discussing their children. She wasn't sure what to expect. Would Daniel push for full custody again, or would he meet her halfway? As she walked to the cafe where they had agreed to meet, she couldn't help but replay the conversations they had had in the past, full of accusations, misunderstandings, and pain. But this time felt different. Daniel had been quieter in recent months. He had started spending more time with Michael, trying to find ways to bond with him, but Ruth wasn't sure it was enough. As she entered the cafe, she saw Daniel already sitting at a corner table. His posture was more relaxed than she remembered. He stood up when she walked in, his face not holding the familiar defensive edge, but something softer. Ruth sat down, taking in the silence that passed between them before either of them spoke. "Ruth, I've been thinking," Daniel said, his voice low, "about our family, about what we want for them. I don't want them to feel torn. I want them to know they have both of us, even if it means making tough decisions." Ruth looked at him, searching his face for any hint of the man who had been distant for so long. She saw something there. Regret, maybe, but also the beginning of understanding. She had to admit it made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. She had spent so long carrying the weight of the divorce on her shoulders, believing she could hold everything together for the children, but maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to bear the burden alone anymore. "I don't know if I'm ready for that, Daniel," she said softly. "I don't know if I can let go of them like that." But she saw his face soften as he reached out and placed his hand over hers. "Ruth, I'm not asking you to give them up. I just want to share the responsibility. I want us to be co-parents in the truest sense. I don't want them to feel like they have to choose between us. Let's work together for their future." There was a quiet weight in his words that Ruth couldn't deny. She had always carried the fear of losing her children to him, but perhaps the real loss was the distance between them, not the space between their homes. The weeks that followed Daniel's decision to meet Ruth halfway were marked by an uneasy peace, but it was a peace that both of them were willing to work toward. Ruth knew that this was not going to be easy. Trust was something that had been broken and needed time to rebuild. The new visitation plan meant that Daniel would have more involvement in the children's lives, and that was both comforting and terrifying. For so long, Ruth had been the sole parent in charge, the one who bore the weight of every decision, every cry, every joy. Now, she had to share that responsibility. The thought of letting go, of trusting Daniel again, was hard for her, but she also knew it was for the best. She wanted their children to have two parents who were committed to their well-being, not just two parents who existed in separate silos. Slowly, Ruth began to accept the reality that maybe, just maybe, their family could be whole again. Not in the way it was before, but in a new way. As much as she struggled with the idea, she started looking forward to the Saturdays when the children would spend time with their father. She realized that these moments were just as important as the ones they spent at home with her. The next few months were filled with adjustment. Michael, who had once seemed anxious about the separation, began to adjust to the alternating weekends with more ease. Ruth was proud to see him thrive, but every time he said, "Mummy, I love you more than Daddy," her heart would ache. It wasn't that she didn't love him just as fiercely. It was that she had become used to being the one who was always there, the one who could always be counted on for comfort and security. But now she had to share that role with Daniel. Ruth knew that he wasn't trying to take over her place as the primary parent, but the transition was tough on her. She had to remind herself daily that this wasn't about losing control, but about giving her children the space to experience love from both sides. And as hard as it was to see Michael call out for her during the handovers, Ruth knew that letting him see the love his father had for him would only enrich his life. It was a painful process, but Ruth was beginning to accept that love didn't need to be a competition. There was enough to go around. One evening, a few months after Daniel's decision to be more involved, Ruth received a call from the school about David. Her son, who had once been confident and determined, was now struggling with his grades. The teacher said he had been distracted, often zoning out during lessons. Ruth tried to make sense of it. David had always been her steady child, the one who excelled in school and never caused trouble. But now he was distant, withdrawing into himself. When Ruth asked him about it, he looked at her with sad eyes and simply said, "I miss Dad, Mummy." Ruth's heart sank. She knew that David had been quietly bearing the weight of their family's breakup in ways that weren't immediately obvious. This wasn't just about visiting his father on weekends. It was about feeling torn between two places, two worlds, and two different ideas of family. Ruth made a mental note to speak to Daniel about David's sudden shift. She had always believed that time would heal the wounds, but now she wasn't so sure. She realized that David, though outwardly strong, was still deeply affected by the separation. The task now was to help him process his emotions, to let him know that it was okay to feel torn, but that he was never alone. Ruth reached out to Daniel the next morning, asking if they could meet. When they sat down at a quiet cafe, Ruth explained what had been happening with David. She told Daniel that their son was showing signs of emotional distress, that his academic performance had started to slip. Daniel listened carefully, his face showing the concern that Ruth had not expected. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "I knew Michael was struggling a little with the change, but I didn't think David was affected too." Ruth nodded. "I think he's been holding it together for us. For a long time, he thought if he was strong enough, everything would go back to normal. But I think the truth is finally sinking in. He can't be in two places at once, and he doesn't know how to feel about it." There was a long pause. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "What do you think we should do?" Ruth sighed. "We need to make sure David knows that he doesn't have to choose, that he can love both of us and still be whole." It was a simple solution, but it wasn't easy. Ruth could see that Daniel was starting to understand the deeper complexities of their situation. It wasn't just about logistics or custody arrangements. It was about the emotional well-being of their children. And together, they had to ensure that the kids knew they were loved, no matter what. Over the next few weeks, Ruth and Daniel worked together to find ways to support David. They attended counseling sessions as a family, making sure that the children had a safe space to talk about their feelings. Ruth also took extra time to sit with David in the evenings, asking him about his day, listening to his thoughts without judgment. Slowly, the distance between them began to shrink. David started to open up, sharing his fears and hopes. He told Ruth that he missed seeing his parents together and that he didn't like how divided their lives had become. Ruth could understand that. She had once hoped that things would go back to the way they were before. The laughter, the family dinners, the feeling of unity. But she had to let that hope go. The reality was that they were rebuilding something new, something that would take time to form. It wasn't going to be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be perfect, but Ruth was determined to make it work. She saw the change in David, the way his confidence was slowly returning, and it gave her hope. As time continued to pass, the shifts in their family dynamic began to feel more natural, though the changes were still significant. Daniel and Ruth both learned that healing wasn't just about adjusting to new living arrangements, it was about shifting their perceptions of what it meant to be a parent. It wasn't just about providing material things, as Daniel had once believed, nor was it only about nurturing the emotional bond, as Ruth had always focused on. True parenting was an integration of both worlds. Ruth found herself increasingly relieved that they had settled into this new rhythm, even though it wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, especially when old wounds resurfaced in heated discussions or when one of the children would express longing for the family that had once been. But those moments were fewer, and their ability to handle them with compassion and understanding was growing stronger. It was a reminder that the foundation they were building wasn't only about proximity, it was about building trust, respect, and cooperation. Ruth had learned to let go of the fear of losing her children, understanding that they were all still a family, just in a different way. The small but significant changes in their interactions, like the way David now came to Daniel for advice about his future, or how Michael would now jump into Ruth's arms with the same joy he did before the divorce, were indicators that they had created a new kind of family unity. It wasn't perfect, but it was resilient. Ruth and Daniel continued to support their children in their respective interests and passions, working together in ways they had never done before. David, who had once struggled with his emotions, now felt empowered to make decisions about his future. He wanted to attend university in the UK, something Ruth and Daniel both supported, even though the idea of David living so far away was a bittersweet reality. Ruth would have preferred to keep him close, but she knew that this was a crucial step in his development. Daniel, surprisingly, was the first to encourage it. He had once been the one to prioritize career over family, but now he saw that his role as a parent was to provide his children with the tools to succeed, not to shelter them from the world. Watching David prepare for this new chapter was a reminder to Ruth that their children were growing, that they were becoming independent, and that, in a way, they had been doing their job as parents. The bond between Ruth and Daniel had evolved from one of necessity to one of genuine partnership. They were no longer fighting each other for dominance in their children's lives, but were instead working together to ensure that their kids had the best possible future. In many ways, this was the most fulfilling role they had ever played. Joy, too, had blossomed over the years. Her passion for dance had led to performances in local theaters, and both Ruth and Daniel were there to support her. They watched as Joy's confidence grew, her stage presence lighting up the room in ways they hadn't anticipated. There were moments when Ruth would glance at Daniel and feel the weight of the years lift, replaced with pride for the young woman Joy was becoming. It wasn't just about her success in the arts, it was about how much she had grown emotionally as well. For years, Ruth had carried the burden of trying to protect her children from the pain of the divorce. But as she watched Joy perform on stage, she realized that perhaps the greatest lesson they had learned as a family was resilience. Joy's ability to pursue her dreams, despite the fractured family structure, was a testament to the strength they had all developed. Daniel, once so distant, had become her biggest supporter, attending every performance, taking photos, and cheering the loudest. Ruth had started to notice the small changes in Daniel too. The way he spoke with more empathy, the way he would sometimes hold her hand during moments of reflection. It was as if the walls they had once built were slowly crumbling, brick by brick. Their co-parenting had become more than just an arrangement. It had become a partnership, one where each of them contributed to the growth and happiness of their children, albeit in different ways. The decision for Michael to attend a new school was another milestone in their shared parenting journey. Michael, once the youngest and most affected by the split, had begun to find his place in both homes. The transition was challenging at first. The unfamiliarity of a new environment brought some anxiety, but Ruth and Daniel worked together to help him settle in. Michael's first day at the new school was filled with excitement, and Ruth found herself walking him to the gate feeling a sense of relief wash over her. Daniel had shown up unexpectedly that morning, his presence a comfort to Michael, who hadn't expected his father to be so involved in the process. Daniel and Ruth stood together outside the school gate, watching Michael disappear into the crowd of children. Ruth looked at Daniel, a soft smile forming on her face. "We're doing okay, aren't we?" she asked quietly. Daniel nodded, his expression softer than usual. "Yeah, we are." And for the first time, Ruth realized that the past didn't define them anymore. The mistakes, the hurt, the separation, it was all in the past. What mattered now was how they had learned to come together for the sake of their children. It wasn't always smooth, and it wasn't always easy, but they had learned to do it together. By the time Michael was preparing for his high school graduation, Ruth and Daniel had found a new kind of peace, one that had taken years to build. They no longer needed to speak to each other in order to communicate. They had found a rhythm in their co-parenting that was seamless, one that allowed their children to thrive despite the challenges. As they sat in the audience during Michael's ceremony, watching him accept his diploma, Ruth felt a quiet pride in her chest. Daniel sat beside her, his hand resting on hers. "We've come a long way," he whispered. Ruth nodded, her eyes misting over as she watched Michael beam with excitement. "We have," she agreed, "and look at him now." For the first time in a long while, Ruth realized that their children hadn't just survived their family's transformation, they had thrived, and in the end, that was all they had ever wanted. The past had shaped them, but it had not defined them. They had created something new, a family that was strong, united, and full of love. And that love, Ruth realized, was enough to carry them through whatever the future might hold.